So welcome to Sunday, everybody. We're going through the old school series. I don't know if you see it online, but we're using the big wheel to show you and represent the old school. Don't know if you had a big wheel when you were a kid. I did. It was awesome. So I want to start with this verse today. It's in Judges. I want to read it for you. It's in Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Doesn't it sound like our culture today? Everyone doing what they think is right in their own eyes. It reminds me a lot of what Sam talks about. Scripture seems to be like the authors of Scripture got in a time machine. They fast forwarded to today and kind of watched what we did, and then went back to their time and then wrote about our culture, because this is everything, it seems like, the world we live in. And I think what's interesting about us and our lives today, it seems like we're just reliving everything that Scripture has already written out, doesn't it? The verse that I just used, like I said, that was in Judges. One of the things I'd encourage you to do is fast forward to Romans 1, verse 18 to the end of the chapter. Again, that's Romans 1, verse 18 to the end of the chapter, because Paul explains how a culture can quickly spiral out of control, and it can just go down this really awful spiritual feeling like rot, decay, and chaos. And Paul puts it this way in Romans 1, verse 18. He basically says, we take our eyes off of God, we don't treat him like God, we don't worship God, and we don't put God in first place. And in the absence of God, we're blinded to God and God things. And when we're in that situation, we're just filled with our selfish desires to live with and live out. And that's really what Romans 1 talks about. So that's really what we're going to talk about today in our story. We're going to kind of jump into Judges. We've been loving the old school series. That just basically means we're jumping into the Old Testament, trying to look at those stories and kind of saying, hey, what was God doing? How does it apply to our lives? We talked about Abraham, Moses, the children of Israel being freed from Egypt. Children of Israel, once they were freed, they were facing a potential death, and Moses tells them, be strong. It's such a great Sunday. Why the 2-year journey in the desert probably should have taken 2 weeks, but why was it 2 years? We talked about that. After being freed from slavery in that 2-year journey, they had to go through a lot of hard times. Why was that? We talked about that. As God continued to bless them and protect them and provide for them, every time they faced hard times, what did we see? We just saw that they embraced complaints, they embraced fear, they embraced rebellion, and they always wanted to go back into slavery. Such a fascinating story. We talked about that. Right before they inherited the promised land and inherited all the good promises God had for them, we see that they got scared, they rebelled against God, and they didn't trust God to walk into every good promise that God had for them. Last week, Sam did a great job because he talked about the next generation, the generation under Joshua, and how they walked into the promised land and they had to go against the city like Jericho and a city like Ai. And he does such a great job. Now remember, the folks, the Israelites who went in the second time, they would have been like middle schoolers and high schoolers when they left Egypt, and now they're all grown up and they were following Joshua. I think the favorite part of mine of Sam's talk was right in Joshua 1, because he emphasized God several times in Joshua 1 saying, hey, I need you to be strong and I need you to be courageous. And I thought it was such a great moment when I heard Sam say, hey, if you think going into the promised land was easy, then God would not have said, be strong and courageous several times. If you haven't had a chance to see that, I'd really welcome you to hit pause now and go back to see it on YouTube. I want you to see this. These stories are about us. The freedom from Egypt really is us accepting Jesus and having freedom from sin. Israel facing certain death, it's really a story about us and how we stand with courage and we trust God. The 2-year journey in the desert that should have been 2 years, and God allowing them to face hard times. God allows us to face hard times in our journey of spiritual maturity. And the reason he does that is he's teaching us what it means to depend on him. Crossing the Jordan River and facing the battle to get into the promised land, that's a story about us. It's a story about us facing our battles, whether it's, sin, whether it's wounds, dealing with things so we can inherit spiritual freedom. Taking on Jericho and Ai, it doesn't matter if the challenges are big or small. We need to be understanding. We need to put our dependence on God, no matter if it's a big day, small day. Sam did such a great job with that last week. Today we continue with the story. And the story where I'm going to be is, Moses dies. The young man Joshua takes over. He becomes the leader. And God comes to Joshua and says, destroy everything. When you go into the promised land, take them all out. It's a holy war. Now, if you're at home and you hear that, or if you read that, it's a little unnerving. You're like, well, why would God say such a thing? That's so mean. Well, you need to understand context in the story. The folks that lived in the promised land at that time, they were so godless, they're so immoral, they're so evil that they were offering their children in sacrificial worship to their idols. And God wanted the children of Israel to end evil. They wanted them to end all of that absolute awful practices that were going on. And if you look at the story of Joshua, where God says to Joshua, hey, go into the promised land and really destroy evil, that's also really a story about us and our journey with God, looking into our hearts and asking God to come and forgive us of who we are, and us being aggressive and getting rid of the sin and the wounds of our lives, right? Here's what happened. Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. Now remember, this is second generation. They would have been 18 or younger when they left Egypt. That means they'd probably be like middle schoolers, high schoolers. Now it's 40 years later. They're 58 years old or younger, and they go into the promised land, and they're supposed to do battle to take over the land, and they did. They had a lot of victories under Joshua. They had a lot of success, a lot of victories. They served Joshua well, but years passed, a lot of years passed, and they became disinterested in the battle. They became tired. They lost their passion. They lost their courage to do what God asked them to do, and they began to compromise. So instead of removing evil, they started to live next to evil. So they didn't look at their enemies as enemies. They looked at their enemies as people to live by. And soon, it wasn't long till their kids married their enemies' kids, their enemies' kids married their kids. They started worshiping idols, and sadly, the children of Israel became wrapped up in the child sacrifice stuff to idols. It was really bad. Now, you might ask yourself, why would someone worship idols? It seems so dumb. You take a piece of wood, carve it out, and then you dress it up with something and you bow down to it. It seems so dumb. Well, you have to understand the context at the time. The children of Israel, they were like farmers, shepherds, and they were growing crops. And you have to understand that when they entered into the promised land, there's an idol called Baal, and Baal really is an idol that was supposed to be the god of nature and weather. Where if you're a farmer, you want to worship whatever god there is to give you rain and sun, right? So they were wrapped up into Baal worship, because if you're a farmer, you want success. And so if you worship God or Baal, that means you're going to have success. That's why they would get involved with that. The other god they got wrapped up into was Ashereth. Ashereth was the god of love and sex. And if you have kids in the room, I'm going to give you a couple seconds to hit mute or get them out of the room, because I'm going to really briefly explain how they worship Ashereth. Did I give you enough time? Okay. So this is how they worship. This is just awful, but they would hire temple prostitutes. And what they would do is they would go to the temple and they would have sex with the prostitutes. That was their act of worship to this goddess of Ashereth. And you can see why they would get wrapped up into this nonsense, right? And so what's interesting is, from their point of view, they probably didn't see idol worship as that bad. They would certainly tell you, well, absolutely, we're going to give honor to God, the Holy One of Israel. He freed my dad from Egypt. I was there. I walked out too. So I'm certainly going to give him honor. But I'm going to worship Baal and Ashereth just to kind of cover my bases. Like, worshiping Baal, what's wrong with that? I'm a farmer. I want success. And let's face it, worshiping Ashereth is kind of fun. So I'm just going to cover my basis. And the problem they had when they took worship of God and added these other things, over time, the worship of God, the Holy One of Israel, that lessened. And the worship of Baal and Asheroth, that increased. And over time, again, slow, small decisions, slow, complacency, slow. It's not a big deal. Slowly, it got worse and worse and worse. And what they did not fully understand is that God and only God is their Savior and provider. They had elevated these wooden sticks that they carved out called Baal and Asheroth, and they elevated them to God's status. And it really broke God's heart because God views his relationship with us like a marriage. And he really views it like he's passionate about that. God says he's a jealous lover, like he loves with jealousy, and he loves you so much, he wants you to love him back. Like he really does view his relationship with the children of Israel and you as a marriage, right? And when we spend a lot of time, when we run to things that are more attractive, or maybe you feel like you're in your trouble and you run to other things and then not God first, it hurts his heart. When we spend a lot of times or a lot of years ignoring him in that personal relationship with him, it hurts his heart. He's a jealous lover. He's madly in love. He views your relationship with him like a marriage. And if you're not talking to him for years, it breaks his heart. To God, us turning to anything else and ignoring him is like having an affair on him. And, what would you feel if your spouse had an affair on you? Well, that's how God feels when we turn to other things and we kind of ignore him, right? That's why God is always saying in the Old Testament, put me first, put me in first place. I love you. I want to read for you what God said about the second and the third generation of the children of Israel. To do this, we're going to jump into the book of Judges. And it really was probably the darkest time period of the children of Israel. It's a really sad time. And so what happened? Well, I think what Paul said in Romans 1, verse 18 on, nails it. This explains what happened in Judges. They took their eyes off of God. They didn't treat him like God. They didn't worship God. They didn't put God in first place. And in the absence of God, they were blinded to the things of God. And in that situation, they were just filled with their selfish desires, and they lived them out. Literally in Judges, you just see this spiraling downward decay of their spiritual condition as individuals and as a country, all the way down to rot, decay, and chaos. And I'm going to read for you what God says about this condition and how he has noticed that since the days of Egypt and, the first generation leaving, how they just became a mess. And it was through these really slow decisions of just compromise. I'm going to read it for you, compromise and complacency. I'm going to read this for you, and it's in Judges chapter 2, verse 1. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said to the Israelites, I brought you out of Egypt into this land, and I swore to give you this land that I swore to give your ancestors. And I said I would never break my covenant with you. For your part, you are not to make any covenants with the people living in this land. Instead, you're to destroy their altars. But you disobeyed my command. Why did you do this? So now I declare that I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be thorns in your side, and their gods will be constant temptation to you. And the angel of the Lord finished speaking to the Israelites, and the people wept loudly. So they called the place Bochum, which means weeping, and they offered sacrifices to their Lord. Now I'm going to drop to verse 10. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of the ancestors who brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Asheroth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel. So he handed them over to raiders who stole their possessions. He turned them over to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned, and the people were in great distress. I'm going to drop to verse 20. So the Lord burned with anger against Israel. He said, because these people violated my covenant, which I made with their ancestors, I have ignored my commands. I'm sorry. Let me reread that. Because these people have violated my covenant, which I have made with their ancestors, and have ignored my commands, I will no longer drive out the nations that Joshua left unconquered when he died. I did this to test Israel, to see whether or not they would follow the ways of the Lord as their ancestors did. That is why the Lord left those nations in place and did not quickly drive them out or allow Joshua to conquer them at all. Now, I just want to pull back, and I want you to see the big picture again. The first generation of children of Israel, they were slaves, they experienced God, and they rebelled, and they didn't follow after God. The second generation, now remember, they would have been 18 or younger when they left, and they were 58 when they walked in, so they experienced God. They walked into the promised land, but the sad legacy of that generation is they grew tired, they grew complacent, and they compromised into idol worship, right? By the third generation, this group of kids, they were born in the promised land. They had everything God promised them. But this generation didn't even acknowledge God or know about his holiness, his power, his supreme ability to care. Like, it is a devastating story that grandpa experienced God and rebelled. Mom and dad experienced God, but they got complacent. By the time I'm growing up in high school, who cares about God? I don't have time for any of that. It's such a sad, sad legacy. There's no awareness of who God was and what he wanted them to do. There's no awareness of what it meant to put God in first place. They didn't follow through on their traditions with good hearts about keeping the Sabbath and staying away from idol worship and just passing on godliness and these festivals God asked them to follow. There's no awareness of the mission of God to eliminate evil. They just became complacent and they lived next to evil. And as a result, God allowed those countries to remain. In every country, or every nation, I should say, that they did not destroy, that nation came back to torment the children of Israel, right? So back to the story of Judges. We're talking about the third generation, and they don't even know about God's power, right? And this leads the children of Israel, like I said, to the darkest days of their existence for about 300 plus years. So if you read the book of Judges, basically from chapter 3 to 16, you read about how those enemy nations came and they tormented the children of Israel. And then you read how God raised judges in the children of Israel to kind of give them 20 or 40 years of peace, right? And then through the chapters, you're literally watching how the children of Israel's culture is spiraling downward spiritually. It's so awful. They're spiraling into rot and decay and chaos, right? And God is sending these judges. But if you read through Judges, you will also notice how each judge is kind of getting worse, more violent, more selfish, more prideful. And ultimately, in chapters 17 to 21, you can see what a culture looks like when it is in just such decay. It's a very barbaric time. There's sexual abuse, there's a civil war, and it's disturbing. And that's the point. When we take our eyes off of God, when we aren't aggressive in putting him in first place, treat him like God, worshiping him like God, and just focusing on him, that's what happens to our souls spiritually, and that's what happens to our culture. I really hope you take the time to read the book of Judges and kind of see if what I'm saying is accurate. Judges is a story. It's a story about us. It's a story about our country. If you want to discover what it looks like when you become complacent when in the spiritual things, what it looks like when a culture kind of becomes complacent in the things of God, and what it looks like to kind of spiral into rot and decay and chaos, you'll read it in the book of Judges. And again, I think Paul in Romans 1, verse 18 on, really, really does a great job because he explains what happens. He said, we take our eyes off of God. We don't treat him like God. We don't put him in first place. We don't worship God. And in that condition, we are so blinded to the things of God. And then when that happens, we are just completely filled with our selfish desires to live out. And what's the result? Well, it's the verse I started with in Judges. It says this, all the people do whatever seems right in their own eyes. It's devastating. What's interesting to me about the children of Israel is how quickly they spiraled into spiritual decay. Isn't that interesting? From grandpa to dad to them, it's crazy. Like, it's just a few years. Like, the first generation rebelled, and all they could do is embrace complaints and embrace fear and rebellion. The second generation experienced God, and all they did was just tapped out. They just compromised and got complacent. They lost their passion and courage. Like, whatever, let's just put up with it. By the third generation, they didn't even know who God was. His great acts of like saving them, it's incredible. It's really kind of a sad story, actually. Can I ask you something? How are you at following God? If God views his relationship with you like a marriage, how's your marriage with God going? Is it healthy? Are you waking up and just spending simple moments with God? Are you talking to God in the mornings or throughout the day? Are you sharing with God what you're happy about and thanking him? Are you sharing with God what you're angry about, what you're confused about, what you're depressed about? Like, are you having moments with God like you would in a marriage where you're just having a lot of conversation? Are you the kind of person that when challenges hit, do you run to God first in prayer? Like, how's that relationship going? Or like when hard times hit, do you not go to your spouse, God? You just go to other friends and family and church people. No, God views this as a marriage, and he wants you to come to him first. He wants you to treat him and put him in first place. I want to ask you another question. Are you having an affair on God? What that means is, are you running to anything but God to kind of make you feel good? Maybe you're expecting things from your church, your spouse, and your friends that you can only get from God. That can be a challenge. That can be wrong. Maybe you're thinking, like, if I'm successful, I get a lot done, look what I achieve. That's going to be the thing that's really going to satisfy me. Maybe you're caught up in addictions and you think, well, if I feed my addictions, that is the thing that's really going to satisfy me. Maybe you're wounded and you're kind of staying in that condition and you're making a choice to stay wounded because you don't want to face those spiritual battles and those hard things to kind of break through to freedom. I have another question for you. Has your marriage with God, has it gotten hotter or is it getting colder? That means maybe if it's getting colder, maybe you don't have time for God. Maybe you feel like you become so busy that you just don't have time for God. And remember, God views this like a marriage relationship. Your marriage relationship doesn't go good when you ignore your spouse. Like, has it gone cold? Like, you just don't have time. You're so busy. Now, just a quick FYI here. I'm not talking about church. Church is great. It can help you with your relationship with God. It can't replace your relationship with God. So church is great, but going to church only is kind of walking through life with a limp, really, spiritually. Maybe you've lost your passion and courage to simply just go after God. What is your marriage condition like with God? When God entered the earth in the form of Jesus, I'm going to read for you what he said. It says this in Matthew 7, verses 13 to 15. Don't look for shortcuts to God. The market is flooded with surefire, easygoing formulas for a successful life that can be practiced in your spare time. Don't fall for that stuff, even though crowds of people do. The way to life, to God, it's vigorous and requires your total attention. So what is your marriage relationship like with God? And in the book of Judges, do you see what we're saying? These stories aren't about crazy people who are ignoring God. No, these stories are stories about us. What happens when we become complacent? What happens when we just kind of lose our passion for God? What happens whenever we fail to kind of put God in first place? I want to go back to what Paul said in Romans 1, verse 18 on. He does such a great job of explaining what happens in a culture, why a person or a culture would just kind of begin to spin out of control into spiritual chaos, rot, and decay. We don't treat God like God. We don't worship God. We take our eyes off of God. We just don't put him in first place. And in that condition, we're blinded to the things of God. And when that happens, we are completely consumed with all of our selfish desires to live out. So my question for you as I leave you, I really want to leave you and challenge you. I want you to read the book of Judges. I want you to read what happens in Romans 1. My question for you is, how is your relationship with God? What God has asked you to do? Are you passionate? Do you have courage? Are you going back to God? Do you feel like the first generation, you're kind of rebelling and pushing against God? Do you feel like the second generation where you're like, I've done the battle. I'm tapping out. I'm tired. Why the battle? I just want to be complacent. Are you the third generation? You're born into this stuff and you're like, who needs God? I don't even know what his deal is. I want you to understand through the book of Judges, some serious stuff. So what is your marriage like to God? Love to hear from you. Love to get some feedback. Email us, talk to us. We are deeply concerned for you as an individual and for our country to understand what it means to put God in first place, because that's everything. I hope Judges has been great for you. Please read it and let us know what you think. We'll see you next week.